Hello, data science students. I hope you're all doing well, staying happy, healthy, and safe. Today is an interesting day. It's one of those days where, we've got unexpected things happening. In particular, today we have lots of snow outside. We're apparently getting hit with a week-long snowstorm in bright, sunny, humid, usually old Mississippi. Uh, this is the biggest one I've ever seen here, and I've gotten some reports from you guys that some of your apartment complexes have lost power, some of your apartment complexes have lost internet. So let's do today's meeting asynchronously. I'm going to show you a little bit of code, mostly dealing with dictionaries to get you ready for your upcoming assignment because that's going to be important. So first thing you're going to want to do to get started with your next assignment is go to the data distribution website. There are two things you want to download. The first one is this guy right here, Sentiment Analysis. This is the data set that you're going to be working with for your next programming challenge. You're also going to want to download the Sentiment Lexicon. This is that dictionary of sentiment values associated with words that we talked about last class meeting. That's going to be what you're going to use to compute your sentiment scores for your data set. So you're going to want to download both of these guys, okay? So once you got those downloaded, you're going to have two files. You're going to have one that is data underscore ch2, that's data challenge 2, data for challenge 2, and then the other one is going to be data underscore sent. Data underscore sent is your sentiment analysis lexicon. And inside of that, you've got these two files, sentiment lex CSV and sentiment lex header. So, let's take a look at the header first. And we see that we've got two columns, one with the header value word and the other one with the header value score, or the header label. So let's look at the actual sentiment lexicon. Okay, so we have words in one column and values in the other column. So same basic format as the data that you were looking at for your first challenge. Now, one of the things that's going to be useful for you in this assignment is using a dictionary. So let's make something called example.py, and let's bring up another terminal so we can run them side by side. So to make an empty dictionary, it's similar to the way you make an empty list. You give it a name. We're just going to call this lex for lexicon. But instead of square brackets, you use curly braces. And that's going to initialize an empty dictionary. So first thing first, we're going to want to read in our data. So straight from our easy bake solutions, we're going to open sentimentlex.csv in reading mode. We're going to want to read that data in. Remember, at this point, the whole thing is going to come in as a single string. So let's just sanity check ourselves and save that and run our code over here. Oh no! I made a bug! We had a typo over here. So it's data equal data.read. Okay. But that's why we code compile. Code a little bit, run your code. Code a little bit, run your code. So you can catch those little typos before they become big typos. Okay, so that works. Okay. So at this point, you're going to want to split your data by new line characters. Okay. And this should give us a nice, pretty, beautiful list. Boom, there we go. Yeah, so, we've got, where we've got a single list item that's a string with our word and the sentiment score associated with it separated by a comma. So we're not quite done yet. We're going to need to separate this out and keep this as a string and convert this to a floating point value. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, just like we did in our Easy Bake Solutions and also in your last assignment. So for index in range 0 to the length of our data, let's print data at index. Again, sanity check over and over and over again. Cool, that works. Okay, so now what we need to do is split each of these lines by a comma. So the value stored at data index, we're going to want to set to data index dot split by comma. If we go back and look at, oops, let's add our print statement back in. So if we look, we've got this single line here still with a comma separating our word and the sentiment score. So we're going to want to break that up into two elements. Okay. And so that's what this split right here does for us. It takes this string and it splits it based on the location of that comma. So this becomes one element of the list and this becomes a separate element of the list. Okay, let's run that and see what happens after we do our split. There we go. That works. That works. So we've got our word and the sentiment score associated with that word in two different columns. Okay. So that's almost where we need to be, but notice the sentiment score is still in single quotes, indicating that it is a string. And that's problematic because we're going to want that to be a number so that we can do math with it. So what we need to do is convert data at index subindex 1, because this is index subindex 0 and this is subindex 1. We're going to want to convert that to a float. Okay, and let's just run our code and make sure that nothing broke. Oh no, something broke! Well, it's not surprising that something broke, because if we looked closely at our data, we saw something interesting that wasn't quite right when we were previewing our data earlier. So let's just do some dumb debugging here, nothing complicated, and just print data at index. And it'll print that before it gets to this line, so at that point it'll get this to the screen just before it crashes. Looks like there's an empty line at the end of the file. That must be what's causing the crash, because one, you can't split that into two things, and since you can't split it into two things, index 1 isn't going to exist. And so when we try to reference index 1, it's just going to crash. So what we want to do is let's add a little code up here. What we can do is we can say while the last element, remember last element in the list is referenced as index -1, while that's equal to an empty string, let's just pop off those last lines of data. So what this will do is it's going to loop through over and over and over as long as the last element in your list called data is equal to an empty string. In other words, it's an empty value. There's nothing there. Okay, so let's run our code and see what we get. Okay, it does not break anymore. Okay, so for sanity checking's sake, let's just print the content of data. Beautiful. Okay. So now we've got the first element in the list being a word, a string, and the second element being a float value that is its sentiment score. Okay. But we're going to want to work with dictionaries. So how do we get this into a dictionary? Turns out it's not too different than working with a list. It's more useful for these purposes to use a dictionary because you can use words essentially as your indices instead of numbers. Because remember, we don't have indices with dictionaries. We have keys, and keys can be numbers, they can be letters, they can be strings, they can be whatever you want them to be. And since they can be whatever we want them to be, it makes sense to use that to look up words for our sentiment analysis. So it can actually serve as a literal dictionary in this case. So the word, we want that to be our key. And that's going to be data at index sub index 0. So the first element in this little list right here. And the value that we want to store there, we want that to be our sentiment score. So data index sub index 1. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. Okay, nothing broke, which is good. You don't want your code breaking. Now we've got our dictionary filled up with key value pairs, where the key is the word that we'd be referencing and the value is the sentiment score associated with that word. Now how do you reference those guys? Well, it's pretty easy. So it works just exactly the same way you would expect a list to work. Except instead of putting a number inside of this, we're going to put a word. So let's get the sentiment value associated with improving. We'll save that, and we'll run our code, and boom, it gives us a sentiment score for the word improving. So this is how you're going to look up the sentiment scores associated with a given word that you read in from your text file. Now, looping over elements in a dictionary, we've got a reference to this in the Easy Bake solutions from our earlier lecture, so if you want to copy and paste that solution for your assignment, you're more than welcome to do that. But just a refresher, it works a little bit differently than looping through the elements in a list. We got to loop instead of through indices, we got to loop through key value pairs. So for key, comma, value in our dictionary.items. And that will put the key for each element in our, or each key value pair in our dictionary in key, and then the value associated with that key in the variable called value. So let's run our code and see what we get. There we go. So it's printing the word and then its associated sentiment score. So if you wanted to change, say we wanted to change the sentiment score associated with stay, just because it happens to be right there and it's a short word. To modify a value in a dictionary, you do it pretty much the same way you would do for modifying the value in a list. You call dictionary name, square brackets, the key, in this case the string stay, and let's set that to negative 0.987, because why not? And we'll save it, and let's get rid of this statement here so we don't get a lot of junk on the screen. So we can print the value associated with stay before our change, and then print the value afterwards. And see, when we print it the first time before we change the value, we get its original value of 0.42. So that's a fairly neutral word. Word values that are close to 0 are not very positively or not very negatively connotated. And then we print it after we make our change, and we get the value that we set it to in our dictionary. Okay, so this is the basics of working with dictionaries that you're going to want to use for your upcoming assignment. history has taught us that actually working with dictionaries and getting your head wrapped around how they function is the primary challenge for this assignment. Everything else, summing things up, calculating averages, those kind of things aren't usually what cause people to stumble. Usually it's just the minutia of working with a dictionary. And once you play around with dictionaries, it's not actually going to be that challenging. And hopefully I've shown you that they behave a lot like lists do. So you're not going to be too terribly surprised at how they work. But if you guys have questions, don't hesitate to talk to me, talk to Riley. You can get us on Discord. You can get us by email, office hours. If you want to screen share your code with us, do that. We're happy to do it. Also, post things that, aren't like specific code related things to Discord, and, have your classmates chime in, because they're doing the same assignment you're doing, so they're going to run into some of the same challenges. As long as you're not sharing solutions, I want you guys working together as much as possible. Just do not share solutions, because those will set off the software similarity checker. All right, so with that said, I hope you guys are doing well, staying warm, staying happy, safe, all that good stuff. And at least in the virtual world, it's a bright sunny day outside the window. Even if it's cloudy and snowy and sleety today in the real world. Anyway, I hope you're all doing well, and I will see you next week.